You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Our guest this week on TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour is history teacher Micheal Martin. He is the author of Shotwell Publishing's newly released book, Southern Grit. Southern Grit is a very interesting book. It's unlike most histories in that it's not so much centered around details such as movements of troops and movements of armies and movements of materials. It's not hung up in statistics nearly as much as it is a verbal telling of what the author calls a sensory perception of battle. In other words, what did the soldier smell? What did the soldier taste? What did the soldier feel? What did the soldier hear? And so there's no better way for me to explain this to you than to just let the author explain it to you. And my conversation with Micheal was very interesting, and it also went slightly over the time allowed. And so rather than me spending a lot of time talking here and having to edit out things that Micheal Martin, our guest, had said in the interview, I'm just going to cut us straight to the interview, and that way we can have all of Micheal's content. So, Micheal, tell us, first of all, who is Micheal Martin?
I'm a teacher. I graduated from the University of South Carolina in 2013 with a degree in history. I got a master's degree in teaching secondary social studies there, too. I'm in my fourth year of teaching right now, and I consider myself just as much a historian as I do a teacher. I really love, digging through actual, real, written history that people, spoke themselves, wrote themselves. I hate just using standard textbooks and things like that to teach people about history. I like working with real primary sources.
Okay. So when you got your degree in history, did you have an emphasis in any particular period of history?
I did. I focused on American history from the Civil War to now, and I was lucky enough to be able to take a couple courses on Southern history too. I had one that was called Cultural and Intellectual History of the South, and the teacher, he was kind of biased against the South, I think. In fact, he wrote a book called John Brown Still Lives. The professor's name was Blakesley Gilpin, and I took another course there with a guy named Mark Smith, and he's an Englishman from the United Kingdom, and he teaches a class on the antebellum South. And I like that a lot. That was the first class I ever had where a teacher actually gave us handwritten documents and asked me to transcribe them. It was really the first history class where I ever really worked with real history. So I got a lot out of both of those classes, honestly.
So when you were transcribing those handwritten documents, was that a hard or an easy task for you?
It was really difficult at first. We were reading the journal of this guy named David Aiken, and he was from South Carolina, and it was his journal from his trip that he took to Europe. At first, I tried reading it and just typing it as I went, and I was having a real hard time. I eventually would get a tape recorder and try to read it and talk into the tape recorder and go back and type it later. But eventually, once I understood his handwriting and was able to kind of get the nuances of his letters, it became much, much easier and simplified, actually.
Well, that's the problem I had, is in two of the books that I've written, I was given extensive access to the journals and the written letters and things of both Jeb Stuart and General Richard Montgomery Gano, and I could not read either one of them's handwriting. I'm so used to reading typed stuff now.
Right. Everybody is.
It was bad penmanship coupled with the inability to read longhand.
I have your book on the Christian testimony of Jeb Stuart, Robert E. Lee, and I have your book about the truth on the Confederate battle flag. And I like how your books are just real simple, easy to read. They don't have a lot of, like academic theories and things like that. It's just straightforward. This is what you need to know. Easy to read. It's very enjoyable stuff.
And I noticed your book is very concise as well.
Yeah. My problem was I wanted to write about my ancestor and he lived in Virginia, and he fought during the siege of Petersburg, all throughout the war between the states. And, there were already books about the Civil War. There's already books about the siege of Petersburg. So I really wanted to narrow it down to just his story and try to tell it from his perspective. And I had some of his letters that I worked with from the Library of Virginia. I had to hand transcribe them and use magnifying glass and all that. The sad thing is, there's just not a lot of people that are interested in looking in documents like that. There's so many books that are just narratives on the Civil War that don't really focus on the individual people that fought it. And I felt like that was something I wanted to try to bring to light for more people.
All right. So who exactly were your Confederate ancestors?
Well, going back from my 4 grandparents, I found Confederate ancestors in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. And then one grandparent I haven't been able to do the research yet. But the focus of my book is my ancestors in Virginia, because they were the only ones I could find actual letters from. Everybody else I found there compiled service records. But the handwritten letter was really special to me because during that time, not a lot of people were very literate. I'd been really interested in the war since I was a kid. And, I was really getting into it in my young adulthood. And when I found out that, hey, I had an ancestor that was there, like a part of me was there, that really confirmed my career choice. And it made me really satisfied in what I decided to do with my life. Everything kind of fell in place and made sense when I found those letters.
Okay, so were those letters what inspired you to write the book?
They were. I hadn't really planned on writing anything up until I found that. I wanted to write something, but like I told you, that as a historian, you almost have to assume that everything has been written about. And it's hard to find original things that nobody has talked about. And I actually found the only other book that has mentioned my ancestors' letters. There's 2 of them that I've found. One is a book on my family history. It's called The History of the Longest Family by some, great uncle of mine. And he actually had the letters. I had to buy that book from the County Historical Society in Virginia. It's called King and Queen County Historic Society. And I had to locate them, contact them, buy that book. And, by that time I had already transcribed the letters, so that didn't help me much. But it was just good to know that other people had done some of that work too.
Well, I know one of the reasons that I wrote the book that I wrote on General Lee was because it was the book that had not been written. Hundreds of books on Lee, thousands of books had been written on Lee the soldier. And I had read probably 60 or 70 of them before I even began to think about writing the book that I had written. But nobody had ever written on Lee the Christian. So rather than writing the book that everybody else had already written, I decided to write that book. It was the same with Jeb Stuart. Everybody wrote on Jeb the soldier. No one had written on Jeb the Christian. Then people started to ask me, they said, when are you going to write the book on Stonewall Jackson? And I'm like, well, 100 books have been written on Stonewall Jackson the Christian, so I guess if I actually wrote that book, it would be on Jackson the soldier. But the truth is, a lot of those books have been written as well. So I don't know that I'd ever write a book on Jackson just because so many other people have already written that book. Why do I need to write another one?
Yeah, that's definitely what I think most people know him for, is just his strong faith.
At the time you were discovering your Confederate ancestors, you were studying metacognition. What is metacognition?
So metacognition is thinking about your own thoughts and trying to understand why you think some of the things that you do. And I became interested in that because, the standard narrative that's in the media and the textbooks and the college classrooms is that the war between the states was strictly about slavery. The Confederates were treasonous, all that number. And I just started thinking about, once I found my ancestors, because I'm in an interracial relationship. My wife is actually from Haiti. And so I started thinking about this stuff. I was like, man, why do I think the things I do about the war between the states? Because I'm looking at my ancestors and I'm seeing none of them owned slaves. and I'm reading the things that they wrote, and it seems like they were going through an awful lot. I really wanted to understand on a deeper level why these men were fighting, like what would make a man want to fight to the death during that time period. And so, looking through those letters, digging a little deeper, I realized that a lot of the stuff that we're being fed is really just like a narrative. It's like an emotional drama to make us feel like, it was some righteous crusade. When in reality, I mean, it's a really dark time period in our history, and a lot of people, I feel like, are just really uninformed about it.
You said that your book was a sensory history.
Sensory history is trying to look at things through the perspective of what people saw, what they tasted, what they heard, what they felt, what they smelled. It's the only difference from any regular history book is that I'm taking careful pains to try to really focus on the sensory aspect. I'm trying to paint a picture almost for the reader. I'm not writing a book trying to pretend that I'm the utmost authority on the war or the siege of Petersburg, because there's plenty of comprehensive books about this thick on the siege of Petersburg. I wanted to tell one man's story and recreate the images that he saw and the things that he felt, so that the average person might be able to read it and sympathize with him and try to understand what was going on in his head that made him want to fight. So, and sensory history was something that professor I mentioned earlier, Mark Smith at the University of South Carolina, is quote unquote expert in. He's written some books on sensory history. I believe right now he's actually traveling around the country talking with MMA fighters and trying to do like a sensory history of mixed martial arts in the United States. And I've always been interested in that stuff because it's just pure history. I mean, there's no real theories or anything behind it. I don't have to make any big statements. I'm just trying to recreate what actually happened in the past.
Do you find it difficult because you're trying to describe smells? And forgive me for sounding glib here. I realize you did not write a scratch and sniff book, but do you remember those when we were kids? Scratch and sniff.
Yeah. I'm a teacher, and I give students every once in a while. I'll put a sticker on their paper that they can scratch it and has a little smell to it.
Yeah.
So it was definitely tough, but when you really look for it, the soldiers that were able to write, a lot of them left behind very detailed accounts. And kind of like you said, a lot of people like to focus on, the military movements and the battlefield engagements and the generals. But nobody wants to stop and think about the common soldiers and what they were going through. There are some pretty good detailed books, but I wanted to focus on one soldier's experience and try to recreate his senses.
Right, but when, for example, you try to describe the things that he was smelling with words, did you find that to be difficult?
It was, but in some cases, they really spelled it out for me. Like, for example, they talked about the Battle of the Crater, and my fourth great grandfather explicitly said that he hadn't changed his shirt in 4 weeks after the Battle of the Crater, which we'll talk about soon. There were hundreds of Union bodies that were covered with a layer of dirt and then a layer of lime and then another layer of dirt. And I found other men in his regiment that actually were commenting on the smell because they had to sit there in the trenches right next to that smell, in addition to their own smells, because a lot of these guys, they weren't bathing regularly. They didn't have access to any hygiene that we have today, like, toothbrushes, shampoo, any of that. So they talked about the smells pretty frequently. And even my grandfather's letters, when he was writing home, one of the things that he asked for multiple times was if his family could send him some of their handmade soap. And I thought that was pretty telling, because a lot of people wrote back home asking for food or for a new pair of socks or whatever, and he was asking for soap. So that really made me think that, wow, he must have a really unclean, dirty feel about him if he was wanting soap more than anything else.
I want to say it was 1864 that Verena Davis, the First Lady of the Confederacy, the Christmas present that she said she liked the best of all the ones she received that year was soap.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. So apparently it got to the place in that war where soap became quite the commodity.
I would think so, yeah. I mean, they were going long, extended periods of time. Some of the research I've been doing shows that a lot of people back then bathed about once a month. So, imagine if you were on the battlefield, you'd probably be bathing even less than that. I mean, maybe every couple months. Or if you got a chance to go in the river, maybe rinse off. But even then, you couldn't get a deep clean like we can today. So I know that was something that a lot of them were probably after, for sure.
Have you ever done any Civil War reenacting?
I haven't. I've watched and read quite a good bit about it, but I would like to because I'm a big camping fan.
Okay, because I've done some reenacting where I've gone as long as 4 days in the same set of period clothing. And,
oh, wow.
But I can't even begin to comprehend what it would be like to go months in that clothing. Let's just say that after 4 days, I was pretty ripe.
And I'll bet after those 4 days, when you took a shower, you felt like as clean as you've ever felt, right? Yeah. That's the best feeling after camping, when you take a shower and you just feel cleaner than you ever have. We really take that for granted. But
were there any particular senses that struck out to you as you were writing or as you were researching? Any of the particular senses that really inspired you or spoke to you in your writing and your research? One in particular that I found looking through a lot of the soldiers' accounts was the sounds. Because, we live in a world today where that's very visual oriented. I mean, from the time we wake up to the time we go to bed, I mean, we're focusing on visual things all day. But they focused a lot in their writings about the sound of a cannon after it was fired, or what it sounded like waiting for a mortar to hit the ground, and that anticipation, not knowing if you're going to be the one that is hit by that. One thing I focused on was, a lot of times they would literally say that, the word Yankee, it would send a shiver down your spine at certain points because, I mean, these men were literally, they were the last bastion at Petersburg, really holding the Confederate capital at Richmond. And, when they were saying the Yankees are coming, I mean, they had to really prepare themselves. Just that word, saying it could really shock you. The sounds of cannons, these explosions, just every day. The one thing that I found they had to look forward to was at night sometimes. Both sides, the Union and the Confederate, would be playing different music. One of the soldiers in my grandfather's regiment noted that, the Yankees had quite better music because they had access to better instruments. And so, focusing on the sound, I think, was one thing that got me really interested because they heard a lot of sounds that were really terrifying. A lot of people dying, a lot of innocent people getting hit by shells and things like that. I mean, there's sounds that we don't even know what they sound like, honestly. I try to recreate it in the book, but I can't recreate the terror that someone felt from those sounds, If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You had mentioned early in your book that the South was the victim of Northern terrorism.
Yes, absolutely. And it's in the slideshow I sent you, what we define terrorism as today. but the FBI Code of Federal Regulations actually defines terrorism as using force against a civilian population for a political objective. And I don't know how you could look at that definition and not feel that it applies to what the Union did to the South. I think that they brought the war to civilians in a really extreme way. They destroyed people's property, and it was all for political reasons. I mean, even if you wanted to say that it was for slavery, well, slavery was protected under the Constitution. I mean, a lot of people say Lincoln himself even proposed what is the name of that amendment that would have forever forbid slavery from being abolished from the Constitution?
I think they called it the Corwin Amendment, maybe.
Corwin Amendment, yeah. So, I mean, even if you want to argue that, oh, well, the South only fought for slavery, that makes it very political. You know, just trying to end that is a very political objective in itself. So even if you want to look at the war as a morality play, there's no way you can really get around our modern definition of terrorism as really applying to what the Union did. It's war, war does things to men. But, well, then let's be real. Let's stop calling it a civil war, because that's not what it was. It was a war to suppress half the country and coerce them into not being independent and to remain in the Union. I mean, if you're going to tell me someone like Edward Snowden, who told American people the truth, is a terrorist, how can you not say someone like Abraham Lincoln, who resulted in the deaths of over 500,000 Americans, is not a terrorist? And that's my goal in the book, is just to get people to question that or to think about it. I'm not going to prove to anybody in a day that, Lincoln was a terrorist, but if I can at least get them to ask that question or think about it, then it'll definitely have been worth my time.
Sheridan, Sherman, Lincoln, Grant, they had a concept called total war. And that concept had never been realized until this war.
Exactly.
There were always rules of warfare in all of the previous conflicts of Western civilization. And war was always conducted pretty much according to the rules. And there was, for example, you didn't attack civilians, for example. But Sherman, in particular, obliterated it. And then when Lincoln signed off on it, and Lincoln referred to it as the total war policy. Not only the people in the South, but the people in the North, and even the governments of Europe were totally just mind blown at just how far the North was going in their aggressiveness, because none of the countries of Europe would have ever engaged in the tactics that Sherman and Grant and Sheridan and some of these men did. They never would have, burned civilian farms to the ground and rounded up women and children and put them on trains and moved them 800 miles away from their homes, never to see their families again. The truth is that nobody would even do anything similar to that until Hitler started rounding people up and sending them to concentration camps.
There's a great book for people that are interested in, the actual people that lived through this, by a guy named William Gilmore Simms from South Carolina. It's called the Burning, Sack, and Destruction of Columbia. I mean, he takes detailed notes of all the businesses and buildings that were burned, all the people who lost stuff. He even tells a story of some Union soldiers who, shot a black man, and Sherman came over and kicked the man over and said, just get rid of this. We don't have time for court martials and things like this. And people always like to portray the South as the aggressors, like, oh, well, the South fired the first shots. Well, if you really break it down and look at what happened at Fort Sumter, Beauregard was exchanging letters with Robert Anderson for quite some time before he fired his first shots, and even told him, hey, this is the exact time we're going to fire those shots. Do you think the American colonists in New England told the British when they were going to fire the first shots at them? Heck no. The fact is, the South really was trying to conduct this thing like gentlemen, and they were doing pretty well militarily. And I think the total war, the blockade, things like that were the only way that they were going to really break the will of the South, I think.
WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction, were available to the Yankees in 1864?
Oh, yeah. So they had a lot of different types of cannons that they had. There was one, I can't remember the name of it, but it was like a giant mortar that they would have to take on a rail car, and they could shoot it. It could blow up, half a town. They had better rifles for sure, but my main argument for the weapon of mass destruction is the undermining that they did at Petersburg. So when these Confederate soldiers were sleeping, these Union men had been digging a tunnel underneath their camp for several days, and they planted 8,000 pounds of explosives underneath them and detonated it. The explosion, I just read yesterday that the explosion displaced, hundreds of thousands of cubic feet of dirt. It killed, it hit underneath a South Carolina regiment and killed almost all the men instantly. If you wanted to look at how much earth was moved by this explosion, it was something like 50 boxcars on a modern train. I mean, it was a massive, massive weapon that they used. And this was something that, no one's ever done really in the history of war. I mean, I've looked into it. There have been some cases where people undermined, to get underneath castle walls and things in ancient warfare. But I've never seen anything where people put 8,000 pounds or anything close to that of explosives underneath their enemy while they were sleeping. The Union came under even more flack for that because they sent their black soldiers to charge first into the crater because they didn't know what was going to happen. And the crater ended up being about 30 feet deep. The Union soldiers couldn't climb out of it. They got trapped, and the Confederates surrounded them and shot everybody in there. And that's where about 700 bodies were buried. That's where a lot of the smells came from because they just got a layer of dirt thrown over them and some lime. And there were actually some trials where the general at the time named Burnside, I'm sure you know who Burnside is. He got put under a lot of fire for that situation, not only because it was an experimental tactic that cost a lot of lives, but for using the black soldiers to march into it first. And I think their logic was something like, oh, well, if we would have sent the white soldiers in, that could have been argued as being too selective or too racist or something like that. They had a really unusual reason for why they sent the black soldiers in first. There's a great book about it. It's called The Last Citadel by a guy named Noah Andre Trudeau, and he goes into detail about how these Union officials, they were, had to go to court for this, and they had to answer for some of these things, but we know none of them were punished for it. We've really never seen a tactic like that in any other war, so I think if something like that happened today, we would definitely be calling it terrorism. I mean, without a doubt in my mind.
Well, Grant, in his own dispatches, referred to Negro soldiers as cannon fodder.
A lot of people felt that way in the Union Army, I think. I mean, they weren't even paid equally to the white soldiers.
So before we get into the particulars about the different chapters in your book, tell us, who was Younger Longest?
Younger Longest, he lived in Virginia in his 30s, I think, when the war between the states broke out. And I've only found 2 letters from him. They were really long letters. That's what I built my book around. And another was later in October, just a few months before Petersburg fell. And I haven't found any more letters, which honestly, the more I research, someone could have written his letters for him. I'm not really sure. He was just a regular farmer, a regular laborer. His family goes back to Virginia from the 1600s. I was doing some genealogical research. His family has been there since the 1600s. A lot of them actually came to this country as indentured servants. And the patriarch of the family, his name is Richard Longest. He had a pretty large land grant in Virginia when he came over, something like 300 acres, I think. So they're one of the oldest families that go back in Virginia, and they have a huge, huge amount of Longists all around the country. So I wish I knew more about him. I can't find a picture of him. I found pictures of his cousin that was shot in the head in the trenches at Petersburg. But I haven't found any pictures yet. I've only found a couple of letters. And, I'm really trying to piece together the puzzle of what his life was. He lived until he was about 80. So he lived a pretty long life. And the war really gave him a new religious outlook on life. That was one of the things that moved me the most about his letters, was seeing that he was writing to his family, telling them things like, if you haven't been baptized yet, you need to do it. Because if you saw the things that I saw in this war, you would know how precious life is. And so that's what really took me back, was that this man went through all this. He owned no slaves. He was a simple laborer. He was going through a heck of a struggle to survive. And at the end of it all, it just brought him closer to God. And that was what really inspired me to want to tell his story.
And so Younger Longest, pretty much then the book is the battle and the war being seen through his eyes, heard through his ears, smelled through his nose.
Exactly. And I use the letters of other men in his regiment to kind of fill in some of the gaps. There's a great book for anybody who's listening, who's interested in primary documents. It's called Greenmount. And it's the letters of the Fleet family. They were a plantation family that lived in Virginia. And the book is, it's pretty thick. It's filled with letters between the sons who fought in the war, the father who was a doctor, the mother, the youngest son who was just a small boy living at home during the war. They were neighbors with Younger Longest. And they were a lot more well written than him. They have a lot of letters. And I was able to use that. I was able to use other firsthand accounts from civilians that were there in Petersburg. So his letters are at the heart of it. And what I wasn't able to fill in directly from his letters is coming from people who were living there also at that time.
So what was your relationship to Younger Longest?
He's my fourth great grandfather through my mom's side of the family. And I told you recently that my mom passed away. She had stage 4 colon cancer. And that was one of the things that also motivated me to want to write, because she had cancer since I graduated from college. And, seeing her, she wasn't even 50 years old. They tell most people not to get a colonoscopy until you're 50. It really gave me a sense of urgency that, if I wanted to do something or write something, there's never going to be a better time than right now. And when I read his story, I was really thankful that I was related to him through my mom's side, because I really wanted her to see me become a writer before she passed away. And I thank God that my book came out about 2 weeks before she passed away. So that was one of my proudest moments, was her being able to see me become a published author. Yeah, he's through my mom's side, and the other ancestors I found in North Carolina were also on her side of the family through her dad's side.
So was your mom in tune with her Confederate ancestry, or was that something that happened after you did the research?
Yeah, she had no idea. In fact, no one in my family had any idea that we had Confederate ancestors. When I was a kid, I would ask my family where we were from, and they were telling us things like, oh, we're Irish, or, we're Welsh and things like that. And they had no idea. And when I looked into it, I was teaching about the Civil War one year, and I got a book. It's by a guy named J.H. Seegers, I think, and it's called In Search of Your Confederate Ancestors. And just got the book on a whim. He said in the book, if you're interested, you should write to the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and they'll do the research for you. So I reached out to them, and sure enough, every time I started looking through a different branch of my family, I found Confederate ancestors. And I found a lot, not even just my direct grandfathers, but their brothers, their whole families were mobilized in this thing. And that's what made me want to understand it more, when I saw just the numbers of people in my family that fought for this thing. I had to know what it was about from their perspective.
So when you mentioned that you'd gone to the University of South Carolina, was Dr. Clyde Wilson one of your professors?
Unfortunately, he wasn't. I went there from 2011 to 2014. I don't know when his last year teaching there was, but the professor I mentioned earlier, Mark Smith, he had actually learned from Clyde. And it's real interesting. It's like because he's an Englishman and he's not a native Southerner, he can pretty much say whatever he wants. But because Clyde is a Southerner, if he starts talking about the South, people get all types of crazy ideas in their head and they want to judge him for that. Unfortunately, I didn't know Clyde until just a couple of years ago, but I wish I had known him during my college years because that would have been a huge help to me.
So was he one of the people that shot well who really helped you to develop this book then?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I found out about Shotwell. I was at a Sons of Confederate Veterans camp meeting, and a young guy my age came and gave a talk there. And I told him I was a teacher, and he just gave me a copy of the book When the Yankees Come by Paul Graham. And I liked the book so much that I went on the website and I emailed them and I said, hey, I really like what you guys are doing, making books that are short and easy to read and hard hitting with just facts. And I told them that I had been interested in writing, and they told me to come to the Abbeville Institute summer school. So I went that year, and that was right around the time that I found my ancestors' letters. And I started writing. I sent them some samples of my writing, and I won't lie to you, Clyde, he'll be very honest with you. If he doesn't like something that you wrote, he'll tell you to rewrite it, or he'll tell you to try something else. And the very first thing I wrote was a book review on a website called the Society of Independent Southern Historians. I have a book review on there for a book by Clarence Poe, how families lived and soldiers fought during the war between the states. And I sent in that book review. Even once I started writing my own book, Clyde was very helpful. I would send him my book as it was coming along, and he would tell me, this needs to be changed. You need to say this in a different way. Change your sources here. So I'm really grateful that I've been able to correspond with him and go to the Abbeville Institute and learn from him. In fact, since I've learned all this and wrote my book, it almost makes me want to go back to college because I didn't know enough to question my professors or, try to debate with them. I just had to take their word on everything. And now that I actually know some real history, I'd like to go back and, really argue with them a little bit more or try to make my point of view a little bit more known, because they're really pushing the anti-South agenda. Not so much Mark Smith, but the first class I mentioned to you, the professor who wrote the John Brown book. Our last day of class, we actually walked to the State House in Columbia and stood under the battle flag. And he gave us this long lecture about how it didn't belong there, basically, and it was backward and things like that. And I was a 19-year-old kid, and I didn't really have the intellectual weight to argue with this guy or really even to raise any questions. And so that's why all this is special to me, because I found out my ancestry and all this after I had college learning about the South. And it's just a total 360-degree difference between the real history, what people wrote and said, and what you're being fed in college and what these professors are trying to tell you about your own history.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. Well, even in Chapter 4 of your book, you talk about how Virginians at the time perceived the Confederate battle flag, in comparison to how we perceive it today.
Yeah, that was really interesting to me because when you look into it, the very first recorded death that I know of, or what a lot of people claim to be the first recorded death of the Civil War, they were two men. One was a man named James W. Jackson. He owned a hotel in Alexandria, Virginia, and he was flying a Confederate flag on top of his hotel. And it wasn't the stars and bars. It was the traditional Confederate flag with the circular stars and the 3 stripes on it. And there was a man named Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, and his soldiers were New York Zouaves. So they had the little fez caps, and they were all fancy. And they came into Alexandria, and they started tearing down anything in the city that had the word Southern on it. They were just throwing things to the ground, burning things. It was literally described as terror. And sure enough, Ellsworth saw this large Confederate flag flying on top of James W. Jackson's hotel. So he took his men up to the top of the hotel. He didn't even tell anyone he was there. He didn't ask to speak with the owner of the hotel. They just went up there and took his flag down. Ellsworth was coming down the steps, and he had the flag draped around him. He said, I'll take this prize. And James W. Jackson had just woken up and realized that these Union soldiers were in his hotel, and he saw they took his flag, and he shot that man, Ellsworth, and then he got immediately shot and killed. And both of those men ended up becoming martyrs for their causes. James W. Jackson, a lot of people call him the martyr for the South. They literally call him Martyr Jackson. And Elmer Ellsworth was described as a martyr on his side. But honestly, I don't think he had any right to just go and tear down someone's flag because he didn't like it. It's very indicative of, how the North conducted itself in that war. There's nothing wrong with wanting to fly a flag, as long as it doesn't have like offensive lettering on it or something like that, or explicit wording on it. I don't see how, a flag could be taken as racist like it is today. So many people look at the battle flag and, it means different things to different people. All symbols do. It just has a lot of history. And the people who want to take it down, they're not looking into the history. They're just being told certain things, and they're running with that. And that's why I was interested in James W. Jackson, because he was a man that was willing to die for that flag. And his country was just a brand new country. It hadn't even, really begun to fight for its independence, and he was willing to die for it. And I just think that devotion is common throughout the South a lot, and people don't want to pay attention to that. They only want to look at the negatives. They only want to look at it in a bad light. Martin Luther King flat out said, "I have a dream that the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will sit down and be at peace." He didn't say anything about Confederate flags, monuments, none of that. So the people that want to take this stuff down, they have a political agenda. They don't really care about history at all. I think that they're scared. California's talking about secession. Vermont's talking about secession. A lot of brown pride people in the Southwest that want, that land to go back to Mexico. The country's really not united right now. Looking at that flag, it's a reminder of secession. And so that's why I think that it's under attack the way it is.
In Chapter 5, you talk about the sights and sounds of battle.
One thing that was really interesting to me was that terror that civilians were seeing. I have one account in there of a man who was just sitting in his house. He was a civilian. He was a doctor. And he describes what it was like for a shell to fly through his house. And he thought he was dead. He literally said, I realized that I wasn't dead because it hurt so badly. People describing, what it's like in these bayonet charges. When they're describing it, they always describe them as a great sight, which is really weird because you would think like, how could that be great? And they really mean it in the sense of like awe, kind of like the Great Depression. Southerners, they like battle, I think. They're more prone to fighting. They're more suited to fighting. And I think that's why you saw the type of mobilization you did. What it was like to see someone that get killed. Like Younger Longest, his cousin John, he poked his head out of the trench for 1 second and got shot in the head. I read about it in another soldier's letters, and they described it by literally saying that the war was deadening the sensibilities of everyone. it's really sad because, everybody in this war was an American. It just doesn't make sense that so many people had to die. I'm really interested the most in probably the civilian aspect of it, like what the civilians saw, because there's a lot of soldiers' accounts. There really are. When you start looking into it, you'll see a lot of different soldiers that had diaries, that wrote letters, but it's really rare to find a good account from civilians. And you undoubtedly will find that there are people that they saw women and children having to run because they were getting shot in the streets with cannon fire. There are people that saw their cities being intentionally burned. And so when you look into these sites, they're undoubtedly proving the argument that these people were the victims of terrorism. I mean, they were just trying to be independent. They weren't trying to take over Washington, D.C. and, subjugate the North and make the whole country, the Confederate States. They just wanted to be let alone. And, that's why I like to focus on the sites.
Right. And in Chapter 7, you talk about the sights and the smells of terror.
The main aspect in the smell for me was, like I mentioned earlier, having to deal with the odors of being in the trenches. We look at World War I and we see these things like trench foot that people had, and people were, beating rats to survive and eat the rats. Well, they were going through all that same thing right here in the U.S. in Petersburg. The smells, I mean, it's hard to recreate a smell, but I think once you understand that these guys were fighting for their lives, they weren't really concerned about how they smelled as much. It kind of makes a lot more sense. I'm really interested in what it would have smelled like to be there on the battlefield, because there's another account by a professor who wrote about a lady named Cornelia Hancock. She has a pretty nice diary from the Civil War, and she talked about the Battle of Gettysburg, how after the battle, all the sense of honor was gone because of the smell. We forget that when a lot of people die, they evacuate some type of fluid from their body. It might be feces, it might be blood, whatever. So when you got a battlefield with 1,000 dead bodies, all those bodies have a smell of their own in addition to whatever fluids are coming out. And it smelled horrible. I mean, no one alive right now in America has ever smelled a smell like that. They never have. And I think if we really tried to sit down and put ourselves in their shoes, maybe people might be a little more sympathetic with these Confederates. They only see them as rebels, but man, they were going through a lot just to try to live their life and be independent.
And in Chapter 8, you talk about the taste of defeat.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite chapters to write about because, the South right now is like the culinary capital of America. I mean, I live in Charleston. People are visiting down here all the time to get a taste of the food. If you watch shows like Top Chef or Chopped, they're always talking about Southern cuisine. It's really well known. It's really famous. But it's also identified with a lot of like really unhealthy things like fried chicken or, Paula Deen cooking with a whole stick of butter and things like that.
My wife made me drive her to Savannah just to take her to Paula Deen's restaurant one night. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of people have those images of the South when they think about food. But when you look at before the war, a lot of them were eating very healthy, and food was almost like a currency. They were what you ate depended on what you were doing that day. So, I've read a lot of instances where people were paid with like a bucket of honey if they went and worked on somebody's fence. Everything came from the land. And, that's something that we really don't have any idea about today. All of our meat is pumped with hormones to fatten up the animals and make the meat soft. We eat a lot of packaged foods today, and everything has some type of corn filler in it. There's literally, if you look on the back of a packaged snack, there's about 100 different names for corn. They call it xanthan gum, fructose, this and that. because they're just filling us up with stuff that's artificial food. And the South was really about healthy, living off the land type of food. And, they almost every, especially in that book by the Fleet family, the letters from the plantation family, they talked a lot. Like every time they sat down for a nice meal, they described what they ate. And, they always had some type of bird. They always had a lot of cakes and jellies, lots of jams, fresh fruit. It was things that came from the land. And my ancestor himself, one of the things that he asked for a lot was apples. I don't know if apples just grew in that area a lot, but he literally wrote to his family and said, some nice mellow apples would be nice. And other people within his regiment referenced that they received apples as gifts from their families. So, it's really telling that, these guys, more than anything, they wanted just something fresh, because a lot of the Confederate soldiers were down to eating things like bacon, a lot of greasy, like hardtack type biscuits. And towards the end, I talk explicitly about the price to live in the Confederacy. At the end, everything was expensive. Bacon was like $10 a pound. A head of cabbage was a few dollars. I mean, everything was really expensive if you wanted to try to buy these things to live. So it gets really interesting when you start looking into what they ate then and how we're eating now. And food is really changing our bodies today, because none of it is real. It's all artificial. It's pumped with chemicals and hormones. I would kill to live back then and be able to taste, a steak from a cow that's been able to roam on free, land and graze the grass. We just don't know what that tastes like anymore.
Well, this is going to sound crazy, but when I was in Cuba last year, that's one of the things that I noticed is that they eat real food there.
Yeah.
And it did. It tasted totally different.
Yeah, I mean, I just watched a documentary with my students the other day called Food Inc. And, it's real sad because, we're from the South. We like living off the land. We like the agrarian lifestyle. But food is just an industry now. And it's run by major corporations that don't care if you get sick. They don't care if you get unhealthy from the food. They don't even want you to know what's in the food. And, I think we could tie that directly to the Civil War if you really wanted to. I mean, that's when we know that industry and corporate greed really took hold in America after that. So, in a way, the South was fighting for agrarianism just as much as they were to be independent.
So in chapter 9 of your book, you talk about modern Southerners being in a Cold War.
Yeah, I'm really sad to live in the time that I do because I'm a young man. I just found out my ancestry and I can't even talk about it. I can't even go to my job and tell people where my family comes from because, people might judge me or, they might think things about me. And, it's fair game to target anything Southern, anything Confederate. And that last chapter, I really try to talk about how faith was one of the one things that really helped these soldiers hang on. Like my grandfather, for example, he had seen a lot of horrible things. He saw his brother get blown apart by a mortar shell, and he described it as his eyes had been blown out. His whole body was black from powder burns. And his brother had actually had a position before that hunting deserters. So, his brother was a man so devoted to the cause that he was hunting down people that were running away. And, my grandfather had to see this guy get blown to pieces. He saw his cousin get shot through the head, poking his head out of the trenches for 1 second. And at the end of it all, he wasn't asking for anything. In fact, he said that it showed him how precious life was. It showed him how important having a relationship with God was. And, the South really is, to this day, it's the Bible Belt. It's where, you have some of your strongest defenders of the Christian faith down here. And a lot of people tend to forget that. I mean, nowadays we're really moving away from Christianity. I mean, almost every one of the Ten Commandments is legal now in some way, shape, or form. And I really am glad that my ancestor, stood up for something. I'm just glad that I can, put my hands in the dirt and say, wow, he stood for something. Because nowadays people will stand for anything, whatever the media tells you to stand for. That's what people will stand for. And I'm glad that, my ancestors, whether it's a cause that people today think is right or wrong, I'm glad he took a stand for something. And, it's very important to me. And when I look at it and see that he was able to go through all that and it just made his faith stronger, that was something that I felt was one of the most important aspects I wanted to share with people. Because I've gone through a lot of things that tested my faith, with my mom being sick and passing away. And his story really gave me a lot more strength to, want to share his story with everybody else and, share some of these good things about the South, because there are a lot of good things. People only look at the negative because it makes more stories. Honestly, it makes for a better news story. But I'm proud of my ancestors. I just hope that we can get to a point in this world where, people can sit down and have a normal conversation about the South or Southern heritage without being labeled as, committing a hate crime or being a bigot. Because that's where we're at right now. Go to the Abbeville Institute, look them up on the Southern Poverty Law Center, and they're all being labeled as, bigots, and they're labeled as a hate group. Some of them, like Donald Livingston, the president of the Institute, is labeled as an ideologue, which you'd have to really be using your imagination to take what the Abbeville Institute is doing and make anything racial out of it, So the world is just, we've come really far removed from where we should be, I think, as far as how we look at history. We don't look at it objectively at all.
Right. Well, how do our listeners go online and find your blogs or your books?
My book's available on Amazon, and it's available through the Shotwell website. I have several articles published with the Abbeville Institute. I think just a couple weeks ago they published my 10th article. And I had a range of topics, not just the war between the states. I like to write about Southern poetry, agrarianism. I like to write about other books that have Southern themes in them. I'm also going to be giving a lecture at the Institute Summer School this year. It's going to be from July 15th through July 20th. And they're going to be talking about Southern music and how it really has been the archetype for American music. And I'll be giving a lecture there about sounds that came out of the Mississippi Delta and Appalachia. So I'm really excited about that. And like I mentioned, I also have a book review on the Society of Independent Southern Historians. But I'm working on some other things now, and hopefully I'll just have more coming and we can do more podcasts. This is my first time I've ever sat down with anyone for a podcast.
Well, when you've got your next project ready to come to fruition, let us know and we'll have you back on the program.
Will do. That sounds great.
All right. Well, we're about out of time, but I've enjoyed the conversation, and I hope that our readers will take the time to look up your book online.
All right. Thanks for listening. I know at certain points I got really long-winded. It's my first time on this medium, so I really appreciate you helping me spread the word about my book, and I certainly will keep spreading the word about your books too.
All right. Well, thank you, Micheal, and God bless, brother.
All right. God bless you too.
That's all the time we have for this week's edition of TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. Please take a few moments and go to my website, www.dixieheritage.net. Subscribe to our free newsletter, receive a free copy of my great book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. After you've done that, go to Google and type in Southern Grit by our guest, Micheal Martin. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on the Shotwell Publishing website. This is definitely a book that you're going to want to check out and read. So until next week, from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, God bless.